Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. It is the week of February 3rd, and this is your Monday briefing. Tariffs were scheduled to take effect tomorrow, and now, less than 24 hours before going into effect, tariffs on Mexican imports are delayed for 1 month. And following that announcement, President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau are scheduled to speak this afternoon about the imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods. Joining me to talk about what to expect are Scott McCandless and Karl Russo. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sindhu.
So before we dive into trade, Scott, we've also been following the budget resolution closely. Could you tell us briefly what the latest is on that?
Sure, Sindhu. The House Republicans held a retreat last week in Florida, and we were hoping to get some more information coming out of that retreat as to what their plans would be with regard to reconciliation. However, they themselves have not decided on exactly how they wish to proceed. We were looking for other indicators, such as whether the House Budget Committee would begin to schedule markups of a reconciliation bill. That too has not yet gone on the calendar. So they are still a little bit undecided as to exactly how they would like to proceed, whether that is from a baseline perspective, using a current law or current policy baseline, whether that is on an overall revenue perspective, how much revenue they might be willing to gain or lose in this calculus, and exactly how they want to proceed with the one bill strategy that seems to be the House approach. The Senate is waiting for the House to make the first steps here. So again, we're in a little bit of a wait and see mode from a reconciliation perspective. And of course, that's the first mechanism that needs to be triggered before we can really get into some of the substance around the tax reform debate.
All right, so let's move into tariffs. What are 2 or 3 things our viewers should know? Karl, let me start with you.
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that there's a lot of uncertainty around what the consequences of the tariffs might be. We haven't really experienced tariffs at the levels that are being contemplated now in a really long time. And so we don't really know how the modern economy would react to those levels of import duties.
All right, Scott?
Sure. There are 2 very specific things with regard to these duty orders from the U.S. side that I think are really important to note. One is with regard to the de minimis standard. There's usually a threshold of $800 or less. And if your customs value for the goods that are coming in is less than that amount, then you don't typically have to pay duties or customs charges on them. They've eliminated that $800 de minimis threshold for goods that would otherwise be subject to these tariffs. So that's a very important note. Then the other item to note is that the duty drawback opportunity is also going away. So typically, if you import something and then simply re-export it, either because you further refined it or because it was sitting on your shelf and then you decide that you don't need it for the domestic market, so you want to export it, you can usually get most of your customs charges back in the process known as duty drawback. Duty drawback will not be available for the additional duties that will be imposed under these recent orders. So those are 2 very interesting, very specific changes that you'll have to be cognizant of because it could affect your supply chain choices.
All right, and let's turn to the economy. Karl, what effect is this going to have on economic projections? And I'm particularly interested in how you look at this in terms of GDP as well as inflation, which has been, topic number 1 for a lot of people. So long and short term on the inflation piece.
Certainly. So the Bank of Canada did an analysis that they released on what they expect the effects on the Canadian economy to be. They expect GDP to be about 2.5 percentage points lower in growth as a result of the tariffs, and for prices to be about 1% higher. If you look at something that economists are projecting for the United States, the effect's only about 0.4% of GDP in terms of negative growth. And the price effects are perhaps similar in scope given the relative size of the U.S. economy, but it depends a lot on a number of other factors. But I think you can see just the overall difference in magnitude of the importance of the U.S. as a market for Canadian goods relative to the other way around. The U.S. economy is much more diversified, and so the effects of these targeted tariffs on Canada and Mexico are diminished in the U.S. compared to into those other countries. If you think about inflation, a lot of that really depends on whether or not the tariffs are passed all the way through to prices, or there's some offsetting effects. One of the things that Treasury Secretary mentioned in his confirmation hearing is that currencies could adjust. And in fact, over the weekend, we did see very significant movements in the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar, for example. And to the extent that that's going on, you'll see smaller effects on prices in the longer run. We expect these price effects to really be phased in. We think the full effect would maybe take 2 or 3 years, depending on how long the tariffs remain in place.
So everyone's going to feel this, but you're saying in terms of immediate impact, it is going to be kind of not measured out, but
it'll take a little time for us to feel all of that.
Okay.
Again, I think companies in the short run, if they think this will be a short run crisis that gets resolved with some negotiation, they might be willing to absorb some of the price increases for some period of time. And so it might take a little while for those to trickle through to the markets, as companies might adjust their supply chains as well if they think this is going to be a longer process.
Right. Okay. And final question for both of you. I know that you're both talking to companies about this. I want to find out, what is a question or two perhaps that companies are asking you or commenting about related to tariffs, and as well as what is a next step for companies right now in this environment, and either that they're taking or that you're seeing as best practice or that you're thinking about as well. So Scott, let me stay with you on that, and we'll end with Karl.
Sure, Sindhu, it's a great question. This is obviously a major supply chain challenge. Not only do we have a well-integrated market here in North America among the 3 countries that has been fairly well oiled for a number of decades now, there are supply chains that don't just go one way. They go multiple times across the border before resulting in a finished product or something that's ready for further market or consumer consumption. So this is a very delicate balance that companies are going to have to engage in to review their supply chain, see where they're vulnerable, see what potential opportunities they have to find cheaper sources, and see exactly how long or how far this will go. So there's an enormous scramble going on. We're receiving a lot of questions over the weekend, and I'm sure we'll receive many today and in the coming weeks as they try to think through how exactly to plan around this. And without duty drawback is one of the things that I mentioned at the top. The opportunities for mitigation become a little more restrictive, but there still are some opportunities to do that, and they're going to have to think very carefully about what supply chain changes they might be willing to make and which are worthwhile relative to payment of the overall tariff amounts.
Okay. Karl?
Yeah, so I think it varies a little bit by company. Obviously, the energy imports are going to be something that are going to affect all companies in all sectors. And I think that's one reason why we're maybe seeing the differential tariff rate imposed at only 10%, as maybe the administration hedging a little bit how much they think the effects might be less severe on tariffs, so a little bit lower rate there. But some sectors are going to be hit very hard by a result of the tariffs. And so those, I think you're seeing a little bit more response from those companies. So this is auto manufacturers, auto parts suppliers, where the effects on trade, particularly the number of times that some of those imports cross the border and therefore get hit again and again with the tariffs, are really trying to think out how they might be able to model out what the consequences are. You know, one of the first important things for the companies to do is to just assess their current situation. What is their exposure to these things? And so that's sort of the first question, I think, the exercise they're undertaking right now. And then second, sort of what would be the costs of alternative? And so a lot of scenario planning. What if we do this? What if we do that? To try to see what the consequences might be for their profitability and their workforce as a result of any adjustments that they might need to make. And I think a lot of that depends on how long they think these tariffs are going to be in place. We saw an interaction with Colombia that was very brief. And the administration got what they wanted right away. It seems like the issues involved here are a little bit larger than what were at stake there. And so we might be in for a longer exercise. But if these really are about negotiations for some desired outcome, then maybe negotiations can resolve the issue more quickly. And then companies would have to make fewer adjustments than they might otherwise need to do if they hang around for a long time.
Sure. Karl, Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and we're going to continue following this very closely, but really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sindhu.
And a note for our viewers, you can find more analysis on tariffs, executive orders, and much more on our website and in the description of this episode. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Take care.